Now I want to go back to your work and to your first books. In Orientalism, when you wrote it, what were you trying to achieve first, and second, what was the reaction that you got?
Well, my whole interest in Orientalism really began, I would have thought, around the time of the October 1973 war, when, for the first time in my history, at least of being aware, there was some Arab military success. 67 was a devastating year for me because everything I'd grown up with, although I was in America by that time, I was alone. The rest of my family was in the Middle East. But everything I had intellectually and politically grown up with, namely Abdel Nasser, perhaps because of the distance from it, had a certain prestige in my mind about it. This was Arab nationalism and so on, and it all crumbled very quickly. And worse, in being in New York at the time, there was a sense of triumphalism, which appeared for the first time in not just amongst Jews, but amongst everybody, where you'd walk down the street and people would say, "How are we doing?" And it was always understood that it was Israel, the plucky little state about to be overwhelmed, but winning this tremendous victory. So there began to grow up in those years or after 67 a kind of library of cliches about Arabs, that they're cowardly, and I remember, for example, my own class of 57 at Princeton. I mentioned this in Orientalism. At the 10th reunion in 67, which occurred just after the war, there was to have been a costume in which we all were supposed to wear Arab costume. And it was changed. And you could wear Arab costume, you're supposed to go barefoot and put your hands up like that. So the Arabs had become representation of defeat and submission and incompetence and so on and so forth. And then with the onset of the 73 war, what I found interesting, and I gave a talk, I remember the first time, at the University of Michigan in the winter of 74, was exactly on this explosion of myths that suddenly, the Arabs were seen as being able to cross the canal, the Egyptians, the Syrians made it back onto the Golan Heights momentarily. And then I started to see the sort of battle for representation, which was very interesting to me, outside the Arab world. And it had very little to do with experiences, the actual lived experience, which is always my main theme, in the Arab world. And I started working on it in a kind of scholarly way, and I started tracing it back to the Middle Ages. And I found a whole library of stuff, mostly religious in the early days, but Dante, for example, where Muhammad is in the 7th or 8th circle of hell as a false prophet and so on. And I decided to write a short book about that. And I got very little interest from publishers, and I had just then gotten, in 1975, an agent. And he was able to sell it to a reputable academic press for $250, and I was, made to understand that I was very lucky. Then we spent the year in California, and I was completely free. I had a wonderful year at the Institute or Center for Advanced Study at Stanford. And there I wrote this book, which grew in ways I hadn't foreseen. And then suddenly became something much more. It became the whole history of representation of the other. I think it was one of the first books to try to do that. And then by the time I finished it, when we came back to New York in the fall of 76, I met socially a prominent publisher who said he had heard about this and could he look at it, at which point I said, of course, and I gave it to him. It was nearly done, quite a large manuscript. And the next day he made an enormously large offer compared to the $250 I got, and so I sold it to him. And at first, the impact it had was, respectful, quite interestingly. I remember the great historian, teacher of a generation of historians at Cambridge, J.H. Plum, reviewed it in the New York Times. And, found it an interesting book and so on. He was slightly puzzled by it. There was that. But it took about a year, I would say, after that, that all the various people implicated in it, not just Arabs and Muslims, but also, you know, Chinese and Indians especially, and then other Arabs and Africans and Latin Americans and women, and, you know, all the ones who had suffered from these representations that were part of the suppression. I mean, it wasn't just a scholarly thing, but also the way these cliches had been used to govern in the colonial state, really made the book very much a kind of hot item. Completely surprising me. I literally had no idea whatever that there would be such an audience for it, and that it would be translated. So, what
was the reaction though from the contemporary scholars that you criticized?
Well, it was interesting. It was a generational thing. The young people, like my friend Bassem Musallam, who reviewed it for Merit, which in those days was a quite avant-garde Middle East sort of dissenting academy kind of thing. Don't forget, this was the tail end of the Vietnam War, and the whole question of scholarship, the role of scholarship in politics and the state was very much in the air, partly due to people like Howard Zinn and Chomsky and others. And so I felt myself to be in some way part of that, but I was really going into uncharted territory because of the subject matter. So the generational thing was quite immediately obvious, that the older people who really thought that the word Orientalism was a dignified word signifying Oriental studies and being an Orientalist, reacted with great vehemence. In some cases it took a while. I mean, Bernard Lewis, for example, took 4 years to respond to me. In the pages of the New York Review, they gave him 15,000 words to write a tremendous attack on me, which I responded to. So it was that. The older people were very hurt and upset by it. Not just the Middle Eastern ones, you know, the scholars of India, and especially because I seemed to be touching on the fact that I was touching on it, but I wasn't insisting on it, that they were not of the people who, they were not the people who were having the experiences, they were writing about them. And I implied in the book that the whole question of Orientalism had to do, partly with who was the audience, who consumed these images, and it certainly wasn't the Orientals, but it was rather these Western scholars who wrote for themselves. Younger people, that was the most interesting thing. Even members of organizations that I had criticized in the book, like the Middle East Studies Association, MISA, within 10 years, my book had become like their manifesto. And there was a complete sort of revolutionizing of the profession amongst the young people, who then became extremely sensitive to the question of Orientalism in both positive and negative ways. I mean, for the negative thing, there was a great deal, certainly in the Arab world, of simplifying, that people thought that I was really defending Islam. And therefore the Islamists used Orientalism, and the book, one of the two books that came after it, covering Islam. Whereas I have nothing to say about Islam in the book at all. I mean, there isn't really anything at all about it. And then others used it as an excuse for a kind of nativism, that only Orientals should write about themselves, which I say explicitly is not what I believe in, the insider-outsider argument. And then there was a whole question, which I think was perhaps the most damaging and serious misreading, which still goes on today, which is to suggest that I identify Orientalism with imperialism, tout court, in other words, that if you study an other, you're automatically being an imperialist and a racist, which is, I don't say that.
But there are instances of that.
Well, of course, yeah, I mean, but I don't say that it's necessary to be of it in order to write about it. In fact, I say quite the opposite at the end. And I end with what I think are quite, interesting open questions about how does, in fact, one talk about the other without making use of these hobbles that are so difficult to dislodge. The pictures we have in our head of what other people are like, that we get from popular sources, in the case of Orientalism, with Islam, of course, it has a long religious background. But in the book, I trace it back to the Greeks. I mean, the Greeks always had their barbarians, and that, whole question of the other was one of the things I pioneered. It became a cliche to talk about the other, or othering. It became even a verb. And Orientalism, of course.
What's the core thesis? What is it you were saying Orientalists were doing?
Well, I made a distinction between two things, really three, but one was the whole question of this division of the world into Orient and Occident. I said that I mean, it's in a certain sense ahistorical. I was accused of that. And I say you can go back to the Greeks and find it there. Herodotus talks about it. And I call it an imaginary geography, because I make the point there's no line on the map that says, you know, from here on it becomes this or that. So, so that seems to have had a long-standing place in culture. By the end of the 9th century, the Orient becomes identified with Islam during the rise of Islam. So the first 400, 500, 600 years afterwards in Europe, writing about the Orient is polemical. Yes, there are people like Marco Polo and others who write about the Orient as a place of marvels, you know, and the whole question of strange beings, you know, Prester John, and there's a whole literature about that. But in addition to it, and gradually overwhelming it, R.W. Southern, the great medieval historian at Oxford, wrote a whole book about it. It's part of the Christian polemic against Islam. So, you know, they represent the Orient as a place of apostasy, of various heresies, of challenges to Christianity, very defensive, because, I mean, there they were. I mean, they crossed into Spain in 711, and they remained there until the end of the 15th century. So that was something to write about. And the third phase, which was the one I concentrated the most on, was Orientalism as it became at the end of the 18th century, because of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. It becomes the formal study of the Orient, scientific. It's no longer a matter of images and fantasies and sort of wandering off into the wild blue, but actual trying to pin it down. And so Napoleon, the Napoleonic expedition to Egypt was deeply significant, in my opinion, because he was the first conqueror of Egypt. And in the preface to this Description de l'Égypte, the man who wrote the introduction, a man called Fourier, says, you know, everybody wants to conquer Egypt. I mean, Caesar conquered it, Alexander, etc., etc. So it's natural that Napoleon, you know, the great emperor of France, he hadn't become emperor yet, but wanted to go there. But the difference between Bonaparte and all the others is that he took with him a team of scientists, archaeologists, biologists, anthropologists, I mean, or the equivalent thereof, and those linguists, of course. And as a result of his stay in Egypt, which wasn't very long, they stayed. They produced this immense book called the Description de l'Égypte, the idea being to take Egypt out of its sort of amorphous, distant state and make it a kind of object of European scrutiny and study. And the first stages were basically linguistics. I mean, Champollion, who was associated with the Napoleonic expedition, his identification of the Rosetta Stone and ancient Egyptian, and then Paris became the center of Oriental learning. So it was mainly linguistics, so you get down the languages. And then around that comes the whole question of the mores of the people, you know, ethnographic observation. And I call it all textual, because a lot of it had to do with writing it down, whereas before it had been legend and lore and this sort of thing. It becomes more and more formalized. And it leads to not only linguistics, but comparative linguistics on the origin of languages, and it becomes a university and academic subject. It becomes, in effect, the main reference point for later travelers. I mean, the example I give that's fantastically interesting is Gérard de Nerval, who was a great French poet who went to Syria in the 1840s. Voyage en Orient. And I was reading along in it. I remember this so clearly. Reading what I thought was a description of Syria, but it seemed like a Syria I'd never seen before. And in fact, it turned out it was Egypt he was talking about, because he had read Lane and half memorized the book, you know, Lane's mores and customs of the modern Egyptians, and internalized that, and that became the reference point, not what he actually saw. So even the evidence of the senses was pushed aside, and so there are Oriental study societies, and you know, the character, the mind, the mentality, etc. And it seeped into all the great novelists of the time. I mean, Proust talks about Orientalism and the advent of that, and it gradually associates itself with imperial rule, so that somebody like Cromer, who had previously served before he became, you know, proconsul in Egypt, had served in India. The Orient really became, again, an indistinguishable place, because it's all the same. They can't think, they can't tell the truth, they can't walk in a straight line, they hate walking on the pavement, this sort of thing, the Orientals. And then at the end, I talk about the United States, how after the dismantling of the classical empires, the British and the French mainly, the Americans take over. But of course there it's social sciences and it's much more abstract because there's no history of deep interaction, and there isn't the adjacency, the physical adjacency, geographical adjacency between the Orient and the Occident. And then I talk about the need to liberate oneself from this. And of course here, this is where the book had a major impact, which was on, you know, on developing countries who were in the post-colonial phase. But people like Fanon meant a lot to me at that point. And so the liberation of the mind, not just of the Islamic or Arab or Oriental mind, but also of the Western scholar, I felt, could be liberated by this sort of study. And I think that's the most important part of the book.
And were you writing, and I hate to put it this way, but were you writing as an Occidental or as an Oriental?
I don't really know. I mean, certainly my training, and I was trained as a comparatist. I remember one of the most, to me, satisfying letters I got was from my old Harvard professor, Harry Levin, who was a known comparatist, probably the best known comparatist in America. When I sent him the book, he said, you know, this really justifies or somehow fulfills the mission of the comparatist better than anything I've seen, you know, because I talk about literature a lot in the book. It's not attacking people. I mean, this caricature of what people say I've done has stayed with the book too long. It's become a term of abuse, as Albert Hourani said. I can't be blamed for that, because a lot of the book is, you know, very minute analyses of texts, literary texts mostly. So I think in that respect I was writing as a Western scholar. But the driving force of the book, as exactly Hourani himself said in a review that he wrote of the book, which he found somewhat mystifying, was that you might say the animus in the book derived from the tremendous gap I felt between these accounts of the Orient that were Western accounts from the outside and my own experience. There was no correspondence between them at all. They were saying things about me and others like me that really never rendered our reality or our experience in any intelligible way. And
wasn't there underlying assumption, though, that you couldn't represent yourselves?
Yeah, there was that. Of course, that was the epigraph of the book. I mean, they cannot be represented, they must be represented. They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. It came from Marx, from the 18th Brumaire. And this period also corresponded to a time when, having for many years myself been alienated, you know, educated alienated in America. In the early 70s, well, I got married for the second time in 1970 to a Middle Eastern woman, Mariam, an Arab woman, and I had a sabbatical in Beirut. This is very important to
This is when we met.
What?
This is when we met. When you had
this is when we met, exactly. We met in Beirut in 1972.
I
was there.
Lecturing on Foucault.
I gave one lecture on Foucault. That's right. But what I was really doing, which you may not have known, was I was being re-educated or re-educating myself through tutorials on a daily basis with our friend, my father's old friend, a retired professor of Semitic languages at AUB, Anis Freha. And I would go to him literally every day, 7 days a week, for 3 hours, from 7 to 10 in the morning. He was an early riser.
For Arabic?
What? For Arabic. And I studied Arabic from the start, you know, which I'd never, I mean, I'd had it, I suppose, but I'd forgotten it or it had been pushed aside. And I focused on, first on philology. So I learned all the principles in a comparative perspective, because he knew Hebrew and Aramaic and so on. So we did that. And then after 3 months of that, we started reading texts. And one of the things that struck me is, of course, I had known nothing about them, was when we read Mahfouz, I read Al-Ghazali, I read Ibn Khaldun, I read all the great classics, Taha Hussein, etc., etc. I realized, you know, that even my own idea of what we were was so basically uninformed by the reality, which was much more complex and interesting, that was part of what went into the book. I say, well, how do these guys talk about this? And even the greatest of them, like H.A.R. Gibbs, who was a professor at Harvard, a university professor when I was a student. I never met him or saw him, but I read his book on Arabic literature. I mean, it was, you know, an admirable book, but it treated the literature like it was written by dead people, you know, rather than the living expression of an actual, you know, human being, which is what so much of it was. Even the most classical, you know, like the poets of the Abbasid period and Ghazali and others. So that was very much at the back of Orientalism, although I didn't make any reference to it, except I was aware that one could talk about a tradition that lay outside the Western tradition with the same concerns, sort of existential human and humanistic concerns, and that was very important to me.
But what was the connection you postulated between this scholarship, this Western scholarship about the Orient, and power?
Well, the idea was that, going back to Napoleon, I mean, that if you wanted to, you know, not just to go in and rampage if you were coming from the outside, but you wanted to go in and impose your own reality on these people by, you know, to rule them. You had to know them. And then I remarked that all the great successful imperial adventures, well, not adventures, expeditions. I mean, of course, the next step was to look at the British in India, and then later the French in North Africa. After Napoleon's adventure was an adventure. It was short-lived. He was defeated by Nelson a few months after he arrived, and he left. But of course, the team of specialists stayed on to complete their work. It took them 4 or 5 years. But if you want to actually rule a country, you really have to do it by knowledge. You have to know the natives. And I noticed, for example, in the works of Kipling, his greatest book, perhaps his only good novel, Kim, I mean, it's the most satisfying thing he ever wrote. One of the main characters in the book is Colonel Creighton, who is, on the one hand, the chief of intelligence in India, but on the other hand is an anthropologist who's writing a survey of India. And that, the coincidence of knowledge and power, which is of course a theme developed by Foucault, had a very concrete embodiment in rule. And I felt that you couldn't really detach the circumstances of knowledge from the knowledge itself, that it was formed with the idea, in the case of, for example, Colonel Creighton of the British in India, there was always a dispute. I mean, do we rule the Indians according to their ways or according to ours? And Creighton and Kipling and others like them were the so-called Orientalists who said, no, we have to learn about them so as not to disturb their patterns of life too much, so they won't rise up against us. Let's keep them going. Then there were the others, especially the Americans later on, who, as we know, for example, from the Quiet American, the prescient novel by Graham Greene in the 50s, where the French leave after
Vietnam.
In Vietnam, right. And then the Americans come in with all these plans, a third way and all this sort of thing, in order to rule it, so they become more American. So in that context, you see also the association between knowledge and power. And of course, there was a big argument around my book as to whether there is any such thing as pure knowledge. I mean, why can't you, for example, read Sanskrit and just be enamored of the language and that's it? Well, I allow for that, of course. I mean, people do things because they want to do them. They don't only feel they have to do them. But as I try to show, the context, certainly in America, which is the America I grew up in the Cold War period, was very much circumscribed by questions of competition with the Soviet Union, so that the study of Arabic, for example, or the study of Russian, but certainly of the Eastern languages, was tied up with questions of national security. An act was actually passed to encourage the study of languages like Arabic and fund them to enhance American security. So, you know, there's no, you could love the language, but the framework is very powerful and impinging. And all I thought was to make people aware of it, that's all. I didn't have any particular thesis about how you should study, but that was later people. I mean, they tried to do that. In other words, liberating Orientalism from that kind of framework.
Do you see that in the scholarship now with the discussion of America's proposed invasion of Iraq?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the, well, perhaps not a lot, but I mean, some of the discussion against the war in Iraq comes from younger scholars who have had experience and have been influenced by Orientalism. And I'm accused of this, by the way, by the Israeli lobby, which is, of course, very, very much in America pushing for war against Iraq. that, you know, that there is a country called Iraq, that it has traditions, it has people. I mean, of course it has Saddam Hussein, who's a terrible villain, et cetera, but there is a society, there is a fabric, there are people, and that these are, that their existential realities taken into consideration. And all of these people, insofar as they know something about Iraq, have been influenced by the kind of questions I raised in Orientalism, you know, 25 years ago. But in general, the other part of what I was trying to do in a later book connected to Orientalism, namely covering Islam, which came out 2 years later, and the question of Palestine, I realized how hopeless it is to change the mass media. In other words, you could have effect on scholars and intellectuals who may or may not agree with you, but at least there is some debate there. With the mass media, it became impossible because the constrictions of pictures and representations increased over time. It's as if, you know, the kind of thing I and many other people after me wrote had no effect whatever. We were back to the demonization of Islam, and the other became the foreign devil, and that whole arsenal of things. And that's what's mobilizing the country. And now, because of the Bush administration, there's a, you know, very heavy Christian infusion, you know, the right-wing Christians who think that these are the enemies of, well, Pat Robertson said, you know, Islam is a violent religion, Muhammad was an imposter. I mean, those are medieval arguments about the man. So that even as a secular person, which I am, I found them, you know, impoverishing and terribly reductive.
In Orientalism, in what way does visual art historically fit into the scheme?
I was very struck by the pictorial representations of the Orient. Actually, before I wrote the book, I remember seeing a painting by Jérôme I'd never heard of in the Clark Museum in Williamstown, Massachusetts, when I was there in the late 60s, quite by chance. And I was, I don't know, I was sort of bowled over because of its representation of an Orient that I'd never seen, and probably it even outdid the Orientalist films that I grew up on, you know, like the Arabian Nights and the films with Sabu and John Hall and Maria Montaz, Thief of Baghdad, all that stuff, which played in Cairo and Palestine, I remember, with great regularity, and they were, you know, among the favorite things that we could see because they were so romantic and so colorful. So the first thing was the color. You know, these very rich blues and purples and sand colors, no trace of dust in any Orientalist painting I ever saw, which is what was the big element in our lives, was the dust. And then, of course, the people were fantastically overstated. You know, it was like every one of them was in italics. You know, just tremendous mustaches and great bournouses and robes, and sitting alongside nakedness. You know, of a I thought rather prurient kind. And the painting that became the cover of Orientalism was this Jérôme called The Snake Charmer, which is really about a boy, you know, whose back is to the viewer, with a snake, naked boy, and a group of what can only be described as dirty old men sitting against the wall of this clearly Oriental building, Arabic building, with Arabic inscription on it. It took me quite a while to realize that the Arabic was not Arabic. It looked like Arabic, but it wasn't actually Arabic.
It was gibberish.
Yeah, it was gibberish. I mean, but it was a fantastically, I mean, it's the kind of thing you wouldn't even think twice about, but because I kept coming back to it, I thought it was my bad Arabic, I couldn't, because it's in a kind of script that's difficult to read. But then I realized that it really wasn't Arabic. But it had this realistic effect on the other hand. So that's why they had such a big market. Is, you know, they actually, I mean, Jérôme actually did live in North Africa. But they became generic paintings. It didn't matter where you were, whether you were representing Egypt or North Africa or Syria or the Gulf. That was the type. And it dealt in types. There were some great Orientalist artists like Delacroix, you know, who really did wonderful things as a result of his visit to Algeria. But there too, it wasn't specific to Algeria. I mean, there was also, you know, took in the Ottoman Empire. I mean, the Eastern Ottoman Empire, and sex and violence were very crucial to that. You know, it was latent sex or sex and death, another motif. And I thought, you know, that it was really astonishing that the people of my generation began to admire this particular kind of art. It was so removed from, you know, the rather sordid realities of our present day Arab world that over time, perhaps partly because of my book, the Orientalists became very valuable items in Arab houses. I mean, wealthy Gulf people who'd come to London in the 70s and the 80s bought them all up. So Jérôme, who was a really second-rate academic painter in the 1860s in Paris, has become a very valuable item if you can find it. And not only that, oh, and Robert's prints and all those things that most people decorate their houses with in the Middle East and abroad, but they ran out of them. I mean, there aren't that many of them around.
Well,
so.
the David Roberts prints were all in books.
Well, they're in books, but then
they were
reproduced.
Cut up.
Yeah, cut up and yeah. But I'm talking about the color. You know, the great academic Orientalist painting, that they developed a kind of thriving market at lower prices by having pictures like that sort of copied and made in Beirut to sell in London as Orientalists, and you know, copies and copies, and then finally they end up in Baghdad, because Baghdad after the Gulf War was, you know, ruined as a city, but it had a large population of draftsmen and painters, quite the largest in the Arab world, and they were dragooned into doing these paintings, and so you could buy them in London, not knowing that they were painted in modern-day Iraq. And then that became outstripped by a larger volume of these paintings done now in China. You know, with obviously inflected a bit with Chinese features, but the same scenes. You know, snake charmers and harems and odalisques and you know, yeah, exactly. Ingres was another one of these painters. Yeah, it's quite a story, but the attachment.
What sense do you make of it?
Well, I mean, it's the Orient that sort of goes. It's sort of a surrealistic or hyper-real Orient, the Orient we would like to have. I mean, even as Orientals. It's a kind of two-way street. It's not just for Western consumption, because it's consumed by Orientals who want the same glamour and romance, which underlines the case for its totally imaginary status. It doesn't have any veridic status at all. It's you know, the fantasies of the imagination. And
do you find the same fantasy in the novels of the period?
Oh, absolutely. Very much so. Early Sherlock Holmes, I mean, you know, A Sign of Four. Although India itself isn't represented except as it's told to a story. It's all about that kind of Orient, and Pierre Loti, the French novelist of the late 19th and early 20th century. And on it goes. I mean, you see it in Malraux, you see it in Gide, and a lot of it is associated with the availability of sex outside the period, outside the societies that are more constraining in the metropole, in Paris and London. So
but isn't this the Oriental being portrayed as object?
Yeah,
always
either
object for projecting fantasies, object of desire,
right,
that is available,
absolutely,
that is subjected to a more powerful realm.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about all this art is that the spectator feels like a voyeur, sort of looking in on scenes of intimacy and display that reach their kind of sort of middle-class apogee. There's a wonderful book about it called The Colonial Harem by an Algerian called Malik Al-Lula. Book came out about 15 or so years ago. He sent it to me because in part it was inspired by my book. And what it is a collection of postcards made by the French in Algeria to send, you know, troops to send home, or, you know, pieds noirs. And all of them are of women, naked women, women who are, you know, sort of living in harems, and many of them, as he says in the book, posed. I mean, they go out and find them and put them together in a studio so that the taste is titillated that way. Yeah, and that's the complete objectivization and sort of consumer quality of the Orient in a very vulgar way. And of course, Hollywood movies play to that. I mean, Rudolph Valentino and the Sheikh, or the Sheik as it's called, comes out of the same thing, as does, for example, the novels of Edgar Rice Burroughs. I mean, Tarzan. There's I think the third or fourth of the Tarzan novels is about. It's called The Son of Tarzan, and it's where Greystoke, who's an English lord, actually goes to North Africa and befriends or is befriended by a dancer from the harem in Algeria. And has nothing to do, any more than the novels have to do with Africa, it's nothing to do with it, but it's hooking on to this fantastically rich and seemingly unending stream of fantasies. Yeah.
Which the Orient itself you now
begins to consume. Yeah, of course.
And accept.
And well, I don't know, accept, but certainly.
But does it do what we're calling Orientals or Arabs or other people in the East?
Yeah.
Do they come to see themselves in these terms that were portrayed by
No,
others?
only I think it's a class thing. I think it's a middle class fantasy of what you put on your walls. I mean, if you have a kind of bourgeois home, but amongst people like Marxists, people connected with obviously with women's movements, feminism, with the Islamic movements, these are all anathema because they traduce the reality and are very vigorously attacked. I think one should take them with a sense of humor because they're really much more revelatory of the people who produce them than they are of anything else.